Yeah, yeah. Reading out loud would be more rewarding, but sometimes the thing that you have to do while doing it doesn't allow for that. And so listening would be the third. Ready? بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم فقد نوينا تعلم وتعليم وتذكر والتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على تمسك بكتاب الله وسنة نبيه والدعاء إلى الهدى والدلالة على الخير وكل ما نواه مشايخنا ابتغاء وجه الله وثوابه وقربه اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما نافعا يا كريم. Alhamdulillah. In our clarification of certain misconceptions or certain things that have become an obstacle or slightly problematic in understanding the deen in an authentic way, is regarding verses of the Quran which would be considered ambiguous, right, or elusive, right? And I think many of the students have taken some of this in the Quranic sciences classes, so for them it will be a bit of a review. And tied into this, right, is the idea of anthropomorphism, right? This is the biggest issue that stems from this initial point of understanding ambiguous text of the Quran and the Sunnah. So when we speak about this idea of ambiguous text, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran, هو الذي أنزل عليكم الكتاب منه آيات بينات هن الكتاب وأخر متشابهات. Actually, I wanted to get which verse it is so the students can see. وأخر متشابهات. Okay. It is Surah Ali Imran, which is the third surah of the Quran, verse 7. Right, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, He is the one who has revealed to you, O Prophet, the book, meaning the Quran, of which some verses are precise. They are the foundation of the book, while others are elusive. Right, and meaning other verses are elusive in nature. The verse continues, those with deviant hearts follow the elusive verses, seeking to spread doubts through their false interpretations, but none grasp their full meaning except Allah. As for those well grounded in knowledge, right, they say, we believe in this Quran, it is all from our Lord, but none will be mindful of this except people of reason. Right, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself in Surah Ali Imran divides the Quran into two types of verses. The definitive verses, or He mentions in that translation, precise verses. Both translations are fine. And He mentions a qualifying factor for the precise verses, that they are the Kitab, they are the foundation of the book. So in reality, that which is definitive, right, of the Quran and of the Sunnah has nothing to do with schools of thought, has nothing to do with scholarly opinion. It is what it is. Right? It is like a tree. You have the trunk of the tree, right, and then you have the branches. There is no difference whatsoever of opinion regarding the trunk. Right? That is Islam. That is the core, the core points of Islam are there. Right, so you don't need to be a Hanafi or a Shafi'i or a Maliki or a Hanbali to understand that you have to pray 5 times a day. Right? That is known directly from Quran and Sunnah. Yes. Now, how do you pray? What times do you pray? Do you read Bismillah at the beginning of Surah Fatiha, or do you not read Bismillah at the Surah Fatiha? Right, these are the details that are not definitively mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah. right? They are, as we mentioned here, ambiguous, right? They are elusive, whichever word you want to use, meaning that they are taken from text that allow for interpretation. Right? And that is where we have schools of thought, and that is where we have scholarly opinion, and that is where we have the chain of transmission through which we have methods of authentic understanding of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us, right? And then there are other ways, right, that are not authentic, right? So this division of the verses, right, this applies to all the text of Islam, right? And most importantly, it applies to the Quran, right, and to the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right, so there are certain hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that are definitive. They do not allow for any interpretations. You don't need a scholar to tell you what they mean, right, as long as you know the Arabic language. They are deen. That is it. That is Islam. There is no two opinions about it. And those are the things, right, which are usually called al-ma'lum min ad-din bil-darura. They are necessarily known to be part of the deen. These are things that the common folk and the scholars are both have knowledge of. Right? The 5 pillars of Islam, for instance. Right? All the Muslims, or at least they should, right, have knowledge of what the pillars of Islam are. These are things that you don't need a scholarly text. You don't need to have an opinion of an imam. Right? They are clear cut. Now the specifics of them, that's a different story. So the Quran and the Sunnah are both divided in these 2 ways. There are hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that are elusive. They allow for multiple interpretations. Right? Funny story, there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that one man istajmara falyutir. Right? Whoever uses the stones, right, the jamra, whoever uses the stones, then falyutir. So there was a teacher once that every time he would relieve himself, akramakumullah, right, he would then make wudu and go pray witr prayer. Right? No matter what time of the day it was, if he were to relieve himself, he would make wudu and then go pray witr. So his student, he said, yeah, Shaykh, with the most adab he could possibly muster up. He said, yeah, Shaykh, I see you every time you go to relieve yourself, you go and pray witr prayer. What's going on? He said, because the Prophet ﷺ, he said, man istajmara falyutir. Whoever uses the stones, meaning for istinja, right, to clean themselves, right, then let them pray witr. And the student said, well, I thought it meant that they should use an odd number. Because witr means, right, it's an odd number. That's why the salat is called witr, because it's an odd number. Right? So there was a misunderstanding there. So that text is actually not elusive. Right? But you can see that the teacher took from it a different understanding, right, than the correct understanding that the student understood. Right now, imagine if it was an actual elusive text, right? How there would be multiple valid interpretations, right? So multiple valid interpretations means it's an elusive text, right? You have, if it's definitive, then there's no room for interpretation, right? No scholar can say, oh, it means something else, right? And this applies to whether it be beliefs or whether it be rulings. All of the beliefs of Islam are established, or all of the beliefs that are obligatory for a Muslim to believe in order to be a Muslim are established by definitive proofs. They are not up for discussion. You don't need to be an Ash'ari or a Maturidi or an Athari. You don't need Imam's opinions about them. Allah is one. How do you believe that? How do you know that? Because Allah said it, not because Imam so-and-so said it. Right? These are decisive texts. So now there are some elusive texts that do have theological they do relate theologically, but they are not obligatory to believe in. Right? Hypothetical situations, such as person grew up on a random island and never heard about Islam and then died. Are they accountable for not believing? Right? That is not it's not obligatory for you to believe one way or another. Right? But there's no definitive text, right, that would say that. There is elusive text that would incline, that would kind of point to that. But all the things that is obligatory for a Muslim to believe are definitive. Right? They do not allow for interpretations. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Say Allah is one. Right? No Imam has ever commented on that with their opinion. It doesn't. You don't need to be a follower of any school to understand what that is. Tamam. So let's look at the outline. Right? And this division is in regards to the meanings of the verses. Right? So when we say that something is definitive, right, there's two ways that could be understood. One thing is first that we have to establish that something is definitive in its authenticity, in its ascription. So for instance, if all verses of Quran are definitive, because all verses of Quran are transmitted by mass transmission that yields certainty, that yields 100% certainty. Right, so it is definitive in the fact that it is a verse from Quran and it is legitimately from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right, it's definitive in its authenticity. As for a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, what would reach that level of definitiveness is the mass transmitted hadith, the mutawatir hadith. Mutawatir hadith are hadith that were narrated from each generation by such a large amount of people that it would be inconceivable, this is a rational judgment, inconceivable that these people all conspired to lie, to put forward a lie. Right? Now, and this is to the extent that most scholars don't consider mutawatir hadith as part of the science of hadith. Right? It is part of the science of logic. Right? It doesn't matter if it's sahih or it's all sahih, it's always sahih. Right? Even if it was children who narrated, even if it was non-Muslims who narrated, if they all saw something, right? It has to be a tangible thing. It can't be a belief. It has to be an observable thing. If all, for instance, if 500 people from China all said that we saw an explosion or we saw a fire, right? And none of those people know each other, and they're all from different parts of China. Right? That is absolute certainty that fire happened. Right? There is no doubt about it. It's a logical judgment. Right? It would be inconceivable and almost impossible for them to all come together in the middle of the night. Like, let's all say this, get our story straight, and we'll all tell the world that we saw a fire. Right? Now, this is assuming that they all saw it themselves and they didn't take the report from someone else. Right? So one person sees it, tells all the news agencies, and they all put it. That's not mutawatir. Because only one person, that's ahad, right? So mass transmitted hadith are definitive in their authenticity, right? And then also included, right, but not at the same strength, is rigorously authenticated hadith are sahih hadith, right? So if a sahih hadith, meaning that we have rigorously established that this is what the Prophet ﷺ said, that is a definitive proof in its authenticity. Right? Meaning that we know that it's the Prophet ﷺ said it, right? With near certainty. Right? So all three of those are authentically definitive. However, what we're talking about today is more about the meaning. It's about the meaning. We'll save time, inshallah. Regarding the meaning, something can be completely definitive as far as its authenticity. It's a verse of Quran. It's a mutawatir hadith. It's a mass transmitted hadith. It's a sahih hadith. But the words that are in that text, right, allow for multiple interpretations. Right? Then that statement, whether it be ayah of Quran or a hadith, is not definitive in its meaning. Right? It is one of the elusive verses or elusive hadith that was mentioned in that ayah of Surah Al-Imran. Right? Allah says that the foundation of the book, majority of the verses are definitive, and others are elusive. And others are elusive, meaning they allow for multiple or valid interpretations. And we'll do a little practicum at the end, inshallah. So what would not be definitive in authenticity, right? Weakly authenticated hadith, right? Your da'if hadith, right? Or lower. And this is why we cannot establish beliefs, right? By anything lower than sahih. Right? Anything less than sahih, we do not establish anything to do with theology. Right? You notice that the Quran is not in this category at all, because all verses of Quran are definitive in their authenticity. Not definitive in their meaning would be verses of Quran that allow for more than one valid meaning, right? Or hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that allow for more than one valid meaning. Tamam. So the main focus that we wanted to do, now all of this has obviously implications in fiqh, right? So the intentional ambiguity that's in the Quran and in the hadith allows for the formation of scholarly thoughts and scholarly opinion, right? So it's almost you could see that Allah intentionally left things ambiguous to allow for difference of opinion. Even to and the Prophet ﷺ himself intentionally did not say things definitively to allow for a difference of opinion as a mercy for the ummah. Even the Sahaba had differences of opinion during the life of the Prophet ﷺ. Right, so the difference of opinion was a natural result of intentional ambiguity, right? And intentionally making verses elusive. Because the key word is there that they allow for more than one valid interpretation, more than one valid meaning. Meaning that it's not that someone differs in a meaning that other meaning is disqualified. No, it's a valid meaning. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that if a woman was given divorce, then her waiting period would be 3 quru. 3 quru. Now the word, he didn't say 3 hayd or 3 tuhur. Right? Hayd would be menstruation, tuhur would be the periods of purity between the menstruations. The word quru means both. Right? Linguistically, according to ancient classical pristine Arabic, the word qar, the singular of quru, means both menstruation and the time of purity between the menstruations. So why didn't Allah just say ثلاثة hayd or ثلاثة tuhur? Why not? Right? He intentionally chose a word that allowed for 2 different meanings. The Imam Shafi'i took one, right? Imam Abu Hanifa took another. Right? So both of those are valid interpretations. Not that one is wrong or the other is right, or other is wrong. They're both valid interpretations. And that's just fiqh. Right? And that's just one issue of fiqh, right, amongst thousands. But what we want to talk about is more of an aqidah issue. It is an aqidah issue. Remember, in order to establish any ruling of aqidah, it has to be definitive in its authenticity. Right? It has to be definitive in its authenticity, meaning that first 3 things, all verses of the Quran can be used, all mass transmitted hadith, and all sahih hadith can be used. Nothing less. No da'if hadith can be used. Even hasan hadith cannot be used. So it has to be sahih or higher, right? Or a verse of Quran. In order to establish any point of creed. Right? But there are elusive verses in the Quran, meaning verses that are definitive in authenticity, right? But they allow for multiple interpretations that do speak about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So, and how we understand those elusive verses does affect our theology. Right? It does have implications in our beliefs on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in this vein, the scholars had essentially 2 approaches to how to deal with elusive verses that relates to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, And there is slightly problematic, right? As Imam al-Laqari, for those who were in the Jawhara class just now, he says, وَكُلُّ نَصٍ أَوْهَمَ التَّشْبِيهَ أَوْوِلْهُ أَوْ فَوِّضْ وَرُمْ تَنْزِيهَ. Right? Any text that seemingly purports a similarity between Allah and His creation, right? Anthropomorphism, that's essentially, right? It seemingly indicates that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like His creation. Then there are two approaches. So these are elusive verses. And I put one on the bottom in the quote section. So we can read it together, and we're going to apply these two approaches with their conditions, inshallah. Right, so in chapter 5, verse 64, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, some among the Jews said, Yadullahi maghlula, Allah is tight-fisted. May their fists be tied, and they be condemned for what they said. Right, so essentially they're saying that Allah is cheap. Allah is not giving them what they wanted, so they're saying Allah is cheap. Rather, right, Allah says in rebuttal to this statement, rather, He is open-handed. Right, bal yadahu. Right, and if you translate it literally, rather His two hands are spread wide open. Right, yunfiqu kayfa yasha. He spends or giving freely as He pleases. He spends freely as He pleases. Right, and the rest of the verse you can read it there. Right, but that is the part that is elusive. Right, essentially the verse is saying that Allah has a yad, right? A yad. Now the Arabic is yad, right? And this is why translation essentially is a type of interpretation, right? Because the Arabic word for hand is yad, right? But I added here from the classical Arabic dictionaries that the word yad has many, many, many meanings. Right? I remember reading a Facebook post, and somebody said, if Allah didn't mean that He has a hand, then why'd He say hand? So I was torn between laughing and being angry, right, out of preservation for the deen, but I fought myself not to comment back, but and I won that battle. He did not say hand. Allah did not reveal the Quran in English, right? Allah said yad, right? Allah said yad, right? And yad has all of these meanings and more. This is a summary. This is a short version, right? Yad has the meaning of hand. Yes, the literal meaning is one of the valid meanings of hand, right? Handle. Right, so power, control, influence, authority, assistance, help, aid, possession, if you're talking about Islamic financial law, benefit, favor, generosity, skill, competence, favor, capability, qualification, achievement, proposal, right? A proposal for marriage, if you're talking about marriage, right? Etc. Give me a hand. See, right? We do it all the time, even in English, right? Which is considered, the scholars of language, a chicken language, right? Even in English, we have more than one meaning for words, right? Lend me your ear, right? You know, the famous movie from the 80s, Robin Hood with Dave Chappelle, and all the people take off their ears and throw it at him, right? Right? That has a metaphorical meaning. There's a literal meaning, which is not obviously intended. Give me a hand, undo your wrist, right? And give them the hand, right? So why can't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala use metaphor? Right? So this is essentially, but the verse is elusive because the literal meaning, right, makes it seem that Allah has a similarity to His creation. So in this regard, whenever there is an elusive verse that would seemingly purport a similarity between Allah and His creation, then we must take one of these two approaches. Why? Because the mutashabihat, the elusive verses, are understood, right, through the muhkamats, through the precise verses, not the other way around. Right? So the precise verses are the basis by which we understand the mutashabihat. And one of the precise verses is لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. that there is nothing like Allah. The verse literally means there is nothing like His likeness. Like it's even 5 degrees separation of likeness, it's still not close to Him, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And also, lam yakun lahu kufuwan ahad. Right? There is nothing comparable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's precise. That does not allow for interpretation. And so we must understand hand of Allah, if we translate it like that, right, in light of those other verses. And this is why we have these 2 scholarly approaches. Inshallah, we'll finish this quickly, then we'll save time. The first approach is the approach of consignment. This is the approach of the earlier scholars, and at the forefront of them was Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala, who is also, as well as being a great scholar of Aqidah, he is also the Imam of the 4th madhab of Sunni Islam, the Hanbali school. Right? So he is also a fiqh scholar, as well as a hadith scholar, as well as a theologian. Right? A theologian. He's a polymath and a person of great scrupulousness. Right? So at his time, Islam began to spread to areas where Greek philosophy, right, had started to influence the Muslims, and a specific group of them called the Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila was a sect, and who, whenever there was some issue, they would always give preference to Greek philosophy, right, in their understanding of Islam, right, over what the scholar said. So a major issue came about regarding the Quran, and Imam Ahmad, he caught the tail end right before this group started to become really well known. He caught the tail end of this, and because of his consignment, his refusal to take the route of interpretation, he was whipped, and he was imprisoned, and he was beaten, and he was tortured, essentially. So Imam Ahmad was the beginning of that new stage. Right? Prior to him, there was none of this issues. There was no issues of Greek philosophy and over-rationalizing things and so forth. That being said, his approach was that if we have a verse that is elusive, and it seems to purport that there is a similarity between Allah and His creation, meaning giving Allah human attributes or giving Allah attributes of created things, then the approach is to say that Allah knows best what it means, what its actual intended meaning is, right? But it definitely does not mean the literal meaning, right? So it's consignment of knowledge to Allah, right? Nufawwid al-ilm ila Allah, right? We consign the matter to Allah. We say that only Allah knows this, right? And we also affirm that Allah is completely transcendent from anything that would be a similarity to creation, right? Because laysa kamithlihi shay, there is nothing like Him. Right? We understand the elusive text in light of the precise text, right? But he would not interpret. So if we go to that list of meanings of yad, right, he would say it definitely does not mean hand, right, the physical hand with the digits and the carpal, right, or whatever. But which other one of these meanings that Allah intended, Allah knows best. Right? We're not going to say it's this one or that one. Right? We would leave it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the scholars, they said that this was aslam, that this earlier approach was aslam, it was safer, it was more cautious, right? It was more in line with scrupulousness in what we say or ascribe to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Which is very much in line with how Imam Ahmad himself was, right, as a person, and how his madhab in fiqh is also represented. He's very cautious. So this was the earlier approach, right? But again, as we said, historically, right after Imam Ahmad, that over-rationalizing kind of methodology started to spread very much. Why? Because the Khalifa of the time adopted the Mu'tazila way of thought, right, as the government's government-supported way of teaching. Right, so it took off, right? Their books started to spread, their teachings started to spread, and obviously these are inauthentic teachings, right, without sanad. And the scholars after Imam Ahmad really had to deal with that even more so, right? So because of that, it wasn't sufficient to tell somebody who was very much affected by this ideology to tell them that Allah knows best, right? That did not suffice their need. That did not suffice their doubts, right? That the Shubuhāt, these doubts that are being whispered to them by these people, right? So the later scholars had to figure out another authentic method of dealing with these verses. And their method was they did ascribe a meaning amongst the metaphorical meanings of that word, and as well as affirming transcendence, affirming that Allah is not similar to His creation. But they did interpret, but they had conditions. Right, and this was something that's that the scholars of the ummah also accepted wholeheartedly, because they understood the need, right, and also because it has precedence in the sacred law itself. So if we look at the example below, right, hand, right, has all of these possible meanings. So their conditions were that, right, obviously we're not going to take the literal meaning, because both groups or both methods affirm transcendence. So the literal meaning is out of the picture. No one is saying that the literal meaning is true. Allah does not have a hand, like so far as we have a hand, right? That does not exist. But which other of these meanings, right, is the correct meaning, the correct intent of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? They had conditions. So the first condition is that whichever meaning of the metaphorical meanings is chosen must be in line with classical Arabic language. It has to be a valid meaning in classical Arabic language. The second is that it must fit the context of the text itself. Right here in the context, we're talking about the Jews are saying that Allah is tight-fisted, that He's not, right, that He doesn't give, right, that He's being cheap, right. And then the third is that whatever the metaphorical meaning that is assigned cannot go against any established belief or understanding in Islam. The first one is the chosen meaning or the interpretation must be in line with the Arabic language. The second is it must fit the context of the text that it comes in. And lastly, it must not go against an already established belief or understanding. Right, so if we applied those three conditions to this exact verse, right, the Jews are saying that Allah is cheap. He's miserly. He's not giving them what they're asking for. Right? He's not giving them the blessings that they want. Right? And Allah's rebuttal is that no, Allah's hands, right? So they said Allah's tight-fisted, yadullahi maghlula, right? That Allah's hands are tied, right? He says, rather He, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is open-handed. His hands are open. Right? And He gives, literally, He spends freely as He pleases. Right? So, which of the metaphorical meanings of yad would apply to this comparison between miserliness and generosity? Right? And giving, right? That Allah gives freely, that Allah spends freely. Which one would you choose? Just shout it out. Is generosity on here? Okay, generosity is on here. What else? Favor, okay. Yeah, they were looking for blessings. What else? Assistance, okay. Right, so definitely generosity is right, straight to the point, right? Allah's refuting their claims that He's miserly by saying that His hands are open, right? Meaning, metaphorically, that Allah is generous, right? And He spends as He pleases. So they allowed for that. Now, this did not come out of a vacuum. Right? This was not solely because of that historical context. Why? Because we have examples of interpretation, right, from the Sahaba themselves, from the Prophet ﷺ himself, and even from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself. Right? There is a hadith Qudsi in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the students, we've taken hadith Qudsi. That's a divine narration, meaning the Prophet ﷺ is saying that Allah said, right? So we have a hadith Qudsi where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he said, on the day of judgment, he brings a certain slave forth, just the context of the hadith, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Maridtu falam ta'udni," that I was sick and you did not visit me. Right? And he's interrogating this slave, right? Now this is a text, right? It's a sahih text, right? So it's definitively authentic, right? However, for Allah to say that he was sick goes against the precise verses. The literal meaning of that, right, is problematic, right? Humans are sick. Humans get sick, right? So the person replies, كيف أعودك وأنت رب العالمين. Listen to this reply. He said, how could I visit you as a sick person when you are the Lord of the worlds? Meaning, you don't get sick. You have no deficiency. You are the Lord of the worlds. Right? So he's saying, like, that nas is problematic for me. Right? That statement itself is problematic for me. Right? So Allah explains, Mariyada abdi, my servant, right, was sick. وَلَوْ عُدْتَهُ لَوَجَدْتَنِي عِنْدَهُ. And had you visited him, you would have found me there. Right? That is an interpretation. That is an interpretation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directly. And right, we have many examples of this. Right? In fact, there is a text that was written that compiled 300 examples of the Salaf, the first 3 generations of the Ummah, interpreting text of the Quran. Just the Quran, not even Hadith. Just the Quran. Right? Scholars like Imam al-Nakhai, al-Alqama, right? Teachers of Imam Abu Hanifa, right? The Tabi'een, the Sahaba themselves, scholar after scholar interpreting elusive verses. Right, so it was not out of a vacuum that they began to do this, but they took it as their methodology, starting from a time of great need in the Ummah. That became almost to the point where scholars, or some scholars, took the position that you would not even mention the literal meaning. You would immediately go for the metaphorical meaning. So if you were to translate something, right, now you can see here, the translator, Dr. Mustafa al-Khattab, he took the majority approach, which is, no, you do say it literally, or you do translate it as the word is literally, but then you explain. Right? He is open-handed in the translation. Some scholars even went as far as saying that, no, you would immediately translate it as the metaphorical meaning. Right? Like, rather, he is generous. Right? You wouldn't even say the word, right? Just to immediately dispel, right, any assumption, right, to the opposite. And this is just one verse. This is just one verse, right? So we have many texts that would fall under this regard, whether it be Quran or Hadith, right? Like Allah's ascension over the throne, right? The kursi being the footstool, right? يَوْمَ يُكْشَفُ عَنْ سَاقٍ, right? The day when the shin will be uncovered. Right? إِنَّكَ بِأَعْيُنِنَا, indeed you are under our eye, our watchful eyes. Right? The hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where Allah descends to the first heaven, right, in the last third of the nights. Right? The hadith that if you come to Allah walking, then Allah comes to you running. Right? So all of these texts, right, both camps would say do not mean the literal meaning. Both of them would say Allah is not like His creation. However, Allah uses language, right, that people can understand, right? And much of it is metaphor, and especially these elusive verses. They're all metaphorically understood, but both camps, they have their own ways. One would say, we don't know what Allah meant by harwala, right? They wouldn't even translate it. right? That Allah will run to you. Right? If you walk to Allah, then Allah will run to you. Like what Allah exactly meant, right? We can't say specifically, but it definitely doesn't mean running, right? The others would say that no, that means that Allah will draw the servant nearer, Allah will give them more blessings, Allah will, right? They would go down that route and actively mention the interpretation. So that's really all we wanted to cover. Now we have about 15 minutes or so for questions. Amir, you have a question for us? Yeah, I'll come this way, to the right. Yeah.
So it was, I think you kind of partly answered the question. Why, in general, when translating or translating the Quran, why not take out more of the kind of like, you know, what we have, like...
Take out the literal meaning?
Take out the literal meaning.
Yeah. Some people chose to do that. I think it's closer to authentic transmission to keep it the way it is and then just explain it. But as for instance, as for like da'wah or teaching, right, then both of these are permissible to take. And according to the people who you are speaking to, it may be better to just straight interpret, right, as opposed to like if someone is coming from a tradition, right, or from another religion where these things were problematic, right, the anthropomorphism or other things, then it may be better for you to just give them the interpretation right away, right, and it would not be considered wrong to do that because that is an approach. But in general, when it comes to like formal translations of books and everything, to keep it as accurate as possible to the words. Even sometimes you sacrifice some of the English in doing that, right? Just keeping things to the word-for-word translation anyway, as opposed to digesting it and saying it in proper English. But that tends to be the approach that most scholars would do for translation. Now, like individually authored works, then they would just say it how it's supposed to be said in that language. But usually translation, they try to stick as close as the words as possible. If anyone's ever seen Sheikh Abdul Karim Yahya translate, right? He's 100%, he says exactly the words, right? He translates exactly the words that anyone who he's translating for is. Whereas other people would just be like, okay, I got that. Let me just say it. Right? Sisters? Asma?
Is there a reason historically why like yad was such a contentious term versus like eye or foot or?
No, they all were contentious. They all were. That for some reason yad became big in America. So some of our fellow Muslims in the Ummah said that Allah has a hand, an actual hand, but not like our hands. Right? Problematic. Right, because none of the Sahaba, none of the Prophet ﷺ, right, none of the Tabi'een, none of the scholars ever added the word actual. Right, because they said, right, Lillahi yadun haqiqatan, lakin laysa yadina. So there was a lot of problems with tajseem, right, anthropomorphism. And Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, he writes in his book that if you were to even just list out, and technically I just did that, but if you were to list out all of the verses, right, and hadith that are problematic, right, that would be, that you would come up with some weird image in your mind of like 3 eyes and 1 foot, and right, and he said it's ridiculous, but and he discouraged even doing that. Because there was people who do not admit that they have anthropomorphic beliefs, but they say things like that, right? That Allah sat on His throne such that the throne felt the weight, right? And that Allah descended from His throne in the last third of the night, like I am descending from the mimbar and taking 3 steps down, right? There were things like that were said by certain people in the past, that drove the scholars to be extra adamant in dispelling these things. And the scholars, they differed as to what the ruling is of that type of belief, right? Anthropomorphism as a belief. Some said that it's kufr, that is disbelief. To say that Allah has a physical direction, that Allah has a weight or size or any of those things, right? To actually believe that is disbelief. The Ash'a'ira, right? They said it's bid'ah. Right? It's a bid'ah. It's not disbelief. It doesn't take you out of the ummah, out of Islam, but it is a heretical belief. But yeah, it's all of the issues, right? And they're pretty consistent. That they always say haqiqatan, right? Or bidhatihi, right? That Allah is on the throne with His essence. Like they add these little words, right? While this denying anthropomorphism, why are you adding these words that makes it even more? Right? It sounds even more. Just say, right? Istawa al-arsh, right? Somebody came to Imam Malik, and I'm just mentioning this because I actually forgot to mention it here. A person came to Imam Malik asking about the verse that the most merciful ascended the throne. Right? Ascension means to be on top of something, right? So the literal meaning is problematic. So Imam Malik, he said, al-istiwa'u ma'lum, that the term istiwa in Arabic, right, which we translated as ascension, but has many meanings. One of them means to have authority. I mean, right, many other meanings as well that would fit. He says, al-istiwa'u ma'lum. Right, the word istiwa is known. And people who know Arabic know what that word means. Wal-kayfu majhul. And how it applies to Allah is unknown. So he was of that other camp. He was Imam Ahmad's camp. Right, he did not go down the route of interpreting. He says, وَالسُّؤَالُ عَنْهُ بِدْعَةٌ. Right? And to ask about it, right, is innovation. Right? And he says, وَإِنِّي لَا أَرَىٰ إِلَّا أَنَّكَ مِنَ الْمُبْتَدِعِينَ, right? Something like that. Right? And I don't see that except that you are of the people of innovation, so get out of my majlis. Right? And you can see in the verse itself that we read earlier, that those who seek out the false to cause corruption, right, seek out the false interpretations. Right, and say that Aisha, she has a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, that if you see those who are constantly delving into the elusive verses, then stay away from them, because they're the ones who Allah mentioned. And this hadith is in Bukhari. Right? It's in the Nur al-Iman that you guys will study after Mukhtar. It's in there for a reason, because those are hadith that are in defense of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Yeah.
So you kind of brought it up in your response to one of the other questions.
Mm-hmm.
But like when someone says, oh, like Allah has a hand, but it's not like ours, or Allah has a leg, but it's not like ours, like essentially like committing anthropomorphism, then immediately following that with, but it's unlike creation. Like how should someone...
Yes, as soon as you translate, that's an interpretation. You've chosen, because interpretation is choosing one of all the possible meanings. As soon as you translate. Now, them saying that Allah has a hand, right, in itself is not problematic, unless they condition it with like a real hand or an actual hand or something like that. That's where the problem is. That's only by necessity that you have to translate it, right, to speak to somebody in other languages. Right, but it should always be couched in understanding that of tanzih, of transcendence, right, affirming transcendence. Like if you're speaking to someone who doesn't know laysa kamithlihi shay', then you would have to add something like metaphorically speaking or something like that. Right, but yeah, it's a problem.
Also, going off that, like, I think Mir had asked like a similar question, but if there's a way to just complete, like, why is it that it has to be translated to hand? Like, why not just
it would be super weird to open the Mus'haf as a convert, like the Quran, and you're just like, and it says, and the yad of Allah is makhduda bel yadahu, right? And it just has random Arabic words in italics, right, with no explanation or anything.
So I'm saying, like, why not just, instead of saying hand, just say generosity and like completely leave out.
So that was one approach, right? Some scholars, they did prefer that. The majority of the scholars, now these are not like early Islamic scholars because they weren't translating, right? Unless you're talking about like Persian and stuff like that. That they would prefer to keep it as accurate to the Arabic word as possible, which would mean using the literal meaning, but then to explain it. Yeah.
So you mentioned that like Hasan Hadith can't be used in Aqa'id, but I think we read in like Sayyid Muhammad bin Alawi's book that said like that it can, but that it's just not used in, or like that it's when it contradicts the Sahih, like the Sahih has preferred.
Yeah, so it can be used as supporting evidence, but not in and of itself.
Right?
It would be used in addition to other definitive text. But if all you had was a Hasan Hadith and nothing else, right, we would not say it's obligatory to believe in that belief. Right?
And then for the elusive verses and the definitive, would that be like قطعي الثبوت وقطعي الدلالة?
Exactly, that is, yeah.
Okay, so it's
قطع الثبوت is definitively authentic. قطع الدلالة is what it means.
Right.
I had this whole thing in Hanafi fiqh class about like all the intentional ambiguity, like full details and everything. And I was like, wow, this is going to take 3 hours to teach. Like it's so deep, right? How the Quran almost set everything in motion for there to be schools of thought. Right? That was the intent of Allah almost, right? You can clearly say that. So, yeah.
So just to like further clarify on like Imam Ahmad translated the example you were saying. It's kind of like he was like, Yed means what it means, and if you know Arabic, you know what it means, and so Allah is unlike any of all creation.
Yeah, how it applies to Allah is majhul, right? We don't know, right? Allah knows. Yeah, so both camps would say like, and Allah knows best. Right? Because even if you say it means generosity, like, is that exactly the intent of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Right? It's most likely the intent because it matches the context, it has all of these other things in it. Right? But out of adab, they would still say, and Allah knows best. Sisters, peace out. Equal opportunities here. Let's do one more, inshallah. Peace out. Oh, Ali. Oh, okay. Bismillah. Online crew. So the different qira'ats of the Quran are essentially various authentic ways of reciting the Quran that all have mass transmitted chains of transmission back to the Prophet ﷺ. Majority of the differences do not result in different meanings, but some of them do. Majority of the differences relates to pronunciation, intonation, like how you would say the word, as far as like tajweed rules. But some of them do have what's called the furush. The furush are alternate words. Now the alternate words, the differing meanings between the qira'at are always complementary. They are never contradictory. They always add a additional dimension to the tafsir or the meaning of the verse. And this is why the great imams of tafsir always considered all the different qira'ats when they did tafsir. Right, so if they did tafsir of a verse and there was multiple ways to read it, they would formulate their understanding of that verse and their comments on that verse, right, based on all of that. And they are all authentic. They are all 10 of them are mutawatir. The other 3 were initially mashhur. Mashhur means you could say well known, I guess you would be translation. That became mutawatir by the acceptance of the scholars. So there's a consensus on those 3 additionally. Originally the 7 are inherently mass transmitted. The other 3 became consensus on them. So so all 10 are useful. You're allowed to use them in salat, all 10. Anything aside from those 10 are considered shadh, right, or inauthentic. Right? They're not authentically ascribed to the Prophet ﷺ, so they're not permissible to read as tilawa of Quran, right, as an act of worship. The scholars differed on to whether they can still be used. Imam Abu Hanifa and a few other different scholars, they said that they can still be used because they're likely just the comments of the Sahaba mixed in. And just like mawquf hadith can be used, right, according to the Hanafi school as an evidence, right, they would consider that a type of mawquf hadith, right, because it's being narrated from the Sahaba and it's not mass transmitted, so that must mean that the Sahaba, right, as was common, that they would, while teaching the Quran, they would sometimes teach tafsir, right, they would explain what this word means or this word if it was from a different dialect or something. I hope that answers question, inshallah. Is there anything else on there? Okay. Marwa?
So some people might ask about, specifically regarding the elusive verses, if the Quran is meant for all time periods, could we reinterpret the elusive verses for our time period? How would you respond to questions like that? And I feel like because they're not pertaining to Aqidah, which is very, it's just very apparent, it's harder to answer for the other types of verses. The elusive verses stretch beyond Aqidah. Right, so there are many elusive verses that, for instance, have legal implications. They affect the law. But outside of Aqidah and fiqh, there are elusive verses in general, just which can definitely be still interpreted differently as time continues. And that's why many of the scholars, they said that the best tafsir of Quran is time. Right, like for instance, one of my teachers, he was talking about the end times and some of the signs, and he said, وَإِذَا الْوُحُوشُ حُشِرَتْ, right, and when wild animals are all gathered, and he said that meant zoos, right, because in the past they did not have zoos. Like, it was a weird thing if you told them, like, we're going to get a bunch of lions together and like gorillas and stuff like that. Like, they would think that's strange. All right, so does that apply to, does that verse of Surah was that Takwir, I think? Or does that apply to zoos, right? So it's elusive, right? What does that mean, right? How does that apply? And then there are verses that are, I guess you would consider them part of the elusive. They're just general, right? وَخَلَقَكُمُ مَا تَعْمَلُونَ, right? And He created that which you do not know. Right, so does that apply to aliens? Does that apply? Right, so it's a rabbit hole a little bit, but there are many verses in the Quran that time will tell, right, more about what they mean. And many of the Sahaba, they saw even certain statements of the Prophet ﷺ, that the Prophet ﷺ gave a khutbah, literally an all day long khutbah. So he prayed Fajr Salat, he ascended the minbar, and he gave a khutbah all the way until Dhuhr. And then he prayed Dhuhr, khutbah all the way to Asr, and then for all 5 prayers until Isha. And after Isha, so during that khutbah, the Sahaba said, وَحَدَّثَنَا بِكُلِّ مَا كَانَ وَمَا يَكُونَ, that he told us everything that was and everything that will be. And the most knowledgeable of us were those who memorized the most from that day. And they said that one of us would see something happen in society. This is after the Prophet ﷺ passed away. See something happen in society, and they would know, like the clearness of the daylight, that was what he was talking about. Right. So time explained things more. So for sure, right, most definitely, there are many things that are still open for interpretation. They usually are, or they're definitely not aqidah related. In most cases, they're not fiqh related, right? They're usually outside of the scope of those two. Hope that answers. Let's pause, inshallah, so we can get ready for salat, inshallah. Any additional questions from the students, we can take it on Monday, inshallah. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.